higher value material, end quote. And this graphic at the bottom is from NAPCOR, which represents PET, and similar to the graph that I showed previously, they say that bottled PET leads to higher process yield. So again, for glass, that was 40% for single stream compared with nearly 100% for bottled, but I don't have those numbers for plastic. The reason that this testimony from these industry folks is so important, it's because they're the ones that make the new cans and bottles, so they have really accurate data about how much is getting recycled and from where. Whereas our MRFs are really more like collection sites. They sort materials, but they don't actually recycle it. They ship the materials off to be recycled. So our state tracks what gets diverted from the landfill in Vermont, but these industry groups are following what actually gets recycled once it goes to the recyclers. So again, this can relate to the previous points I just made. We may have diverted 18,000 tons of glass from the landfill in Vermont, but it may have been secretly dumped, or it may have been sent to a facility where 60% is then sent to some other state's landfill. But the state will still call it diverted, and it will factor into Vermont's recycling rates. And just to hone in on this point one more time, there's, when we talk about what's the difference between bottled glass and single stream glass, yes, it's the type of product that it can be recycled into. Bottled glass is more likely to be turned into a new container. It's where these products where these materials get shipped off to. Bottled materials are much more likely to be processed in the Northeast, whereas single stream materials are more likely to get sent down south. But the point I really want to drive home that other folks don't talk about as much is the yield. So again, that 40% versus 98%, how much of this material, once it's actually sent to a recycling facility, can actually be recycled. And that is a really dramatic difference between single stream and bottled material. This is the part that I'm going to skip, but
the nickel,
how it moves, just because folks do, I think it is confusing, and looking at a graphic can make it easier. So I'm going to submit these slides and you can look at it, or if anyone has any particular questions about the movement of the nickel, I can talk about that. The main point is that it's passed circularly through the system, and no one actually pays the nickel unless the consumer does not get their beverage redeemed. And the handling fee is a separate cost from the deposit, which is paid by the manufacturer distributor to the redemption center or retailer, and the cost of the handling fee changes based on whether those containers are commingled or not.
Right. And sometimes I've heard people confusingly call that the second nickel.
Right. Folks do get it confused. And when we talked about the deposit on wine moving to 15 cents, some folks thought that was the handling fee and had concern over that. So that's why I made these beautifully illustrated, if I do say so myself. Such good graphics. So there are a lot of stakeholders in this process, and a lot of them have concerns that I do think this bill as written addresses really well. So I'm going to talk a little bit about how it does that. But first, I forget who asked this question a few minutes ago, but why, I think Senator Watson, why did the committee decide to create a PRO last year? So the PROs create this centrally managed system. It's a nonprofit organization made up of the manufacturers and distributors. Almost every bottle bill in the world outside of the US runs this way, and Oregon does too. And I know that other states in the US are considering having a PRO-esque model as well, like California and Connecticut again. So a centralized system is more effective at meeting set goals like the redemption rate. And thus, because they have to meet those goals, they're more incentivized to increase consumer convenience and do so efficiently and cost effectively. So you'll hear more about this from Matt, but right now DEC administers the bottle bill system. They have funding for less than one person to do that. So consumers and retailers and redemption centers, they basically have no one that's fully accountable to their concerns that can make adjustments to the system in real time. And of all the actors and the stakeholders in the system, it really is the manufacturers who have both the resources and the capacity to actually make this happen, and the law requires them to do that. So this is going to be a nonprofit independent entity, not fully independent, but nonprofit entity that's receiving millions of dollars a year from the state and its sheets, and they are going to be accountable for the success of the redemption centers and the redemption rates. To be clear, this was not our idea to have a PRO. We were initially a little concerned about it. This is really kind of the beverage industry favorite approach, but ultimately we felt like the benefits that this would bring to redemption centers and to consumers really couldn't be achieved in any other kind of system. I do want to talk for 1 second about the House's decision to add the trigger, or they call it the escalator for deposit. I think you all know the deposit hasn't been changed for over 50 years. However, the redemption rate has remained pretty high at 75%, which is why in the previous iteration of this bill, it did not propose to increase the deposit. So the House's decision would really be to increase the deposit only as necessary to ensure that the system is meeting our set targets, which are in the bill, and it would be 2 consecutive years, so really giving some more flexibility there. We feel that it's important to understand that the action of raising the deposit is really the most effective policy tool to make sure that redemption rates are going up. Other levers that are intended to increase the redemption and recycling rates, they're helpful, but they have not.
Really?
Oh, that's okay. They haven't significantly changed redemption rates elsewhere. So that includes adding more redemption locations and having a public education campaign. We fully support those measures, but again, they are already required under this bill, and in practice, they haven't actually produced the same kinds of results as increasing the deposit. Also, the deposit trigger, as you've heard, is exactly the same method that worked in Oregon really well to increase their redemption rates. So the stakeholders and how this bill addresses their concerns. So for redemption centers, in that interim time before the PRO goes into effect and eliminates brand sorting, which we'll talk about in a second, the handling fee for non-commingled containers goes up 1 cent. It doubles the volume of containers that are handled, which I don't want to understate how important that is. That literally doubles the revenue that's coming into redemption centers, their ability to pay their workers more, which is a huge concern. And they're going to be able to do so more efficiently because, again, they're not having to spend the time sorting each of the containers by brand and taking up all that space. And also because the PRO is required to ensure timely pickup of containers from redemption centers, which is a really big concern that the smaller redemption centers in particular weren't getting their containers picked up frequently enough. So the PRO can both hold TAMRA more accountable. TAMRA is the third-party pickup agent that's contracted to pick up the containers. The PRO can also contract its own drivers and trucks to service redemption centers. The PRO could also help redemption centers get technology to crush and compact the containers so that they save more space. But that is in the bill that they are required to do that. Grocers have really similar concerns to redemption centers in that, like, the current system could not handle the doubling of containers because of brand sorting and pickups. And again, both of those are already addressed by this bill. Also, the PRO is already required to consult with stakeholders. But if we are concerned about how grocers would be impacted, it could, be specifically stated that participating retailers could join the stakeholder group. And then also, as you've heard, retailers under 5,000 square feet are exempted from having to take back containers. That's both small and medium-sized retailers. So it's really just the larger ones that will still have to take back containers. How does this impact consumers? Again, as you heard, I won't spend too much time on this. The bill adds convenience standards, which will really just ensure that folks have much more access to redemption centers, including here in Montpelier, a densely populated area that is not served by a redemption center, and currently, I think, is an equity issue.
We picked 7,000 last year, specifically to make sure that the capital had a redemption center.
Exactly.
Because it was 8,000 at one point.
Right, and the redemption centers in dense areas, designated downtown districts, was something I felt strongly about. I live in Burlington, and downtown Burlington does not have a redemption center. They're on the outskirts, but folks that collect cans have to travel over the Winooski Bridge to the redemption center in Winooski, and that's dangerous and out of the way. And again, it's just not necessary. So concerns by MRFs and solid waste districts. Solid waste districts have felt like glass in the system is really onerous. And so including wine in the expansion provides a lot of relief to Chittenden Solid Waste District, mainly as a concern, as well as some of the other solid waste districts. Also, we've heard of the cost concerns of taking the valuable materials out of the stream for the MRFs. So MRFs are able to increase their tip fees to account for lost revenue, which they say that they are willing to do if this goes into effect. This has been characterized as, the cost of recycling to Vermonters will go up X%, which I just want to take a step back and recognize that haulers pay a tipping fee, yes, based on the tonnage that they're carrying to MRFs. And if we're diverting more glass, which is really heavy from the single stream recycling system, haulers are also carrying less tonnage to the MRFs. And in other states, this is actually looked to be like pretty cost neutral for consumers. But even if tipping fees go up without that counter effect, that looks like it would be about a $1 to $2 per household per year increase in price. So it's really not a dramatic or onerous price for Vermonters. You've heard about these. I'm happy to talk about any of them if folks have questions or concerns, but I won't go into them in detail. Some things that we would recommend to further improve this bill. To be clear, we really support this bill and are happy to see where it is from the House, but we do feel that 2027 is a pretty unnecessarily long timeline for expansion, and that there's not really a justification for it. It was really a compromise to the administration who doesn't want to see expansion happen, but to put it into context of other states' timelines for increasing and expanding the containers, California's expansion of wine and spirits was about a 15-month timeline, and the PRO would be formed a year after that. Connecticut's expansion took about 18 months. Quebec's expansion and creation of a PRO had 18 months. Connecticut and New York expanded their bottle bills to include water with no PRO about 15 years ago. So we feel that 40 months is unnecessarily long. And also that many of the most important responsibilities that are going to be held by the PRO really won't be feasible until expansion happens anyways. They won't be able to hire more drivers if there aren't more containers in the system. They won't be able to set up additional profitable redemption centers if we don't have the volume to meet that. So we don't feel that the PRO needs an additional year to set them up for expansion.
So you're proposing expansion prior to the PRO coming online?
Right. So what this committee had passed last year and what the House initially considered would have been expansion in 2026, which is still 2 years after the PRO is formed.
Can you just say a little bit about what additional convenience standards for large chain retailers means?
Yeah, it's basically exactly a provision passed in Connecticut's expansion, which just recognizing that redeeming shouldn't be any more burdensome than going grocery shopping in the first place. Large chain retailers like Target and Walmart and Price Chopper all have to have, in Connecticut's language, it's 2 reverse vending machines. We don't have to specify that specific technology, but 2 points of redemption that provide an immediate return of deposit to consumers for those big retailers that are still going to be participating in the system. And I will be getting new language for all of these. I didn't have time to throw it together before this, but we'll get that to you soon.
So for those large stores, is the thinking basically, if you're the source of a lot of material, then participate in redeeming a lot of material.
Right. It's also so often these big retailers, CVS, Walmart, they actually don't participate in the system at all. And these are the retailers that have the greatest capacity and resources to have this kind of technology. And so it shouldn't be, the smaller retailers that are having all the burden of accepting containers, but these bigger ones should as well. Technology and redemption centers, we've talked about this a little bit already, but technology can make redemption centers significantly more efficient and profitable, and it saves space by crushing containers, but there can be a really steep initial investment to purchase that technology. So we would recommend that it's just another step on the list that the PRO has to produce in their report, that they have to ensure redemption centers have a financial incentive to have technology upgrades and potentially providing low or no interest loans for reduction centers to do so. So this version of the bill that this committee put a lot of work into crafting last year is really thoughtfully recommending parts of different bottle bills across different states and different countries, but it is really specifically fitted to the Vermont context. And I do think it will allow this program and redemption centers and consumers to thrive in this system. So we do really recommend that you support H158.
Any committee questions from Ms. Gallagher? Senator Watts?
Thank you. Do you have any information about the governance structure of PROs in other states?
How it differs from Vermont's?
Either that or I guess I'm wondering about the voices of small manufacturers. I know there's a provision in here that says, you know, take into consideration the needs of small manufacturers, but does that amount to like a legitimate like voice at the table, or is it like you have a voice as percentage of the volume that you sell or gets redeemed, or you know what I mean? Like, so that would mean they have a smaller voice, that kind of thing.
I think other witnesses would probably
Okay.
have better.
Okay, no worries. Thank you.
Okay, great. So we'll watch for language to suggestions related to your recommendations at the end. If you could also send your PowerPoint to our committee system, that we can post it. That will be helpful for people who are going to watch this. And one of the things that I said. Okay, thanks so much. Next, I'd like to welcome back to the guest chair also, Mr. Chapman. Good morning.
Good morning, Senator Bray.
Is this the first testimony in this committee this year?
It is, Senator Bray, yes.
How did we go so wrong?
So for the record, my name is Matt Chapman. I am the Director of the Waste Management and Prevention Division within the Department of Environmental Conservation. And here to speak about the bottle bill generally and H158 specifically. You know, I think it may be good to just sort of take a step back and talk about why H158 and some of where the bottle bill came from, what sort of its purpose was. I mean, I think the bottle bill, as I said, was created in 1972. It was primarily when it was created a litter reduction law, not a recycling law. So it was intended to basically get the bottles that were on the sides of the road off the sides of the road and collect it. And in fact, there's very little to no mention in the bottle bill of recycling the contents. That's of course what happens, and it is the right thing, but it's not predominantly a recycling base.
There was a picture in the Addy Indy back when this happened. I was in the archives looking, and there's a pull-off on Route 7 south of Middlebury, and it was astounding how many bottles were in. It was like, anyway,
Yeah.
hundreds of bottles just lying around at the rest stop.
Oh my goodness.
So
It was a mess.
So with the bottle bill, it predates most of our modern conceptions of either recycling or extended producer responsibility. And I think it's probably, again, maybe good to take one step back and talk about, since the committee hasn't dove into EPR programs much this session, just like what EPR is and why we as waste management regulators are pushing things in that direction, right? So the purpose of an extended producer responsibility program is to basically have the manufacturers of a difficult to manage commodity or waste stream to manage it through the life of its product, and basically manage its end of life. So both collecting, managing it, and being responsible for those costs. And so there are a number of programs that Vermont has put into place that are extended producer responsibility. Electronics waste, there's a number of mercury containing products that are EPR eligible, paint, batteries, and other things. So the bottle bill is predates EPR and has some EPR concepts, but it doesn't have a lot of the core concepts that we normally look for when we look at EPR. And the largest one is convenience to the consumer. We, as a state agency, really don't have a way to promote, enhance where collection points happen under the bottle bill as it exists today. And so if you look at a map of redemption centers in the state of Vermont, you will see there are some areas where there are 3 redemption centers on the same street. And then there are other areas where there are vast distances between, where you can redeem containers. So that's one of the challenges. And frankly, it's one of the things that H158 goes about trying to address, which is making the bottle bill system more accessible to Vermonters and making it easier and more equitable for people to basically return cans and bottles when they go through. The other is, I think there are normally education and outreach components and special handling of the end-of-life material components. The bottle bill, unlike some of our other EPR programs, it's not, the materials we're talking about are not materials that are harmful in any way, like mercury or e-waste or batteries, for example, right? They're things we want to get out of the landfill because they're valuable commodities. They're not things that we want to get out of the landfill because they result in environmental impacts when they go in there. So I think globally, H158 accomplishes a lot of those objectives. And I think, 3 of you sat through some of the challenges when expansion came through last year, and without a corresponding producer responsibility organization. I think it's worth probably just saying, right? Like Vermont's bottle bill system is very similar to how Maine administers its bottle bill system. We are primarily a redemption center based redeeming jurisdiction. There are a lot of other states that are more reliant on retail. There are a lot of states that are more reliant on electronic sort of reverse vending machines and other sorts of approaches, right? We're a very redemption center focused. When Maine expanded their bottle bill, and again, probably worth talking about a few terms, right, that we threw around in bottle bill world. So one is commingling. Right, so there's this concept of commingling, and what commingling basically is beverage brands working together to basically prevent sorting at a redemption center and sorting either based on a formula or based on representative samples at some other area and splitting the costs amongst the people who are part of that commingling agreement. And so we have a differential handling fee depending on whether you are or are not part of a commingling agreement. When we first adopted commingling, I think it was about 10 years ago, it might have been a little longer, we saw a lot of the beverage brands go into commingling. The number of sorts significantly decreased. Over time, that's changed. What we've basically seen is Vermont, there's about 100 different sorts the last time that I've checked. Maine, that has a robust expanded bottle bill system, has over 500 sorts and 6 different commingling agreements. So and I think it's the challenge that we identified. If you talk to redemption centers and people who do redemption in this state, they will tell you that act of sorting is time consuming. It takes up space in their facility. It's difficult to find employees to do this type of work. Maine is definitely experiencing that challenge today. They actually, I know in talking to my colleagues there, they're having very significant systemic problems with their bottle bill because of these issues. So H158 in many ways is an effort to try and address those by effectively compelling all manufacturers to participate in one organization that ultimately then becomes responsible for the administration of the system as a whole, ranging from finding and setting up collection locations, making sure that the public is educated on the need to bring their beverage containers back to those collection locations. And they're financially responsible for the whole administration of the system as opposed to A&R being responsible for portions of it. So it shifts that responsibility back to the manufacturers. We have an oversight function, but we don't have a sort of administration function like we have today.
Yeah, our field trip last year, I think, was convincing that there needed to be an EPR or PRO component woven into it, because people were already struggling with the containers they had. We were hearing about waits like in Bennington on a Saturday of a mile and a half. I saw the same thing in Middlebury. So even for people who wanted to return stuff, it was too burdensome.
Right.
On customers and on redemption centers. And there were a handful of redemption centers that said, keep going, we would love more volume. There weren't that many of those, so.
And we did a trip down to Barry,
Yeah,
and they were sort of begging us not to give them more, but they were full, right? They had trouble handling what we were
they
giving.
had a huge amount of space full of empty bottles, and I think Tomlin had to go there like twice a week at least, just to have them empty out the room in order to be able to keep on accepting more material.
Sure. I mean, I think the other thing, just to amplify the concerns that the committee heard last year and that I think begin to get addressed through H-158 is the number of times that redemption centers get serviced, the pickups, that smaller rural redemption centers don't get the service, or were voicing their concerns that they were inadequately serviced by the pickup agent for under the current system. And again, this tries to address that by forcing the PRO to manage that more appropriately and plan for it in their plan.
Does that mean that the secretary, when approving the plan, can ensure, a reasonable level of responsiveness on the part of the organization to get to those small rural stores?
Absolutely.
That's it.
Thank you, Chair Bray. So the contract now, and I apologize, I was out of the room if you covered this. So the contract that we have now, that kind of third party organization, they're the ones who are also doing the pickups currently from those rural carriers or those rural redemption centers? Or did they contract out to a different? Yeah.
So the way it works right now is that there are commingling agreements, right? Those commingling agreements exist between various manufacturers. So the state is not a party to them.
Yeah.
We don't really know what the terms and conditions of them are. The administrators of the commingling agreements, and I'd actually recommend you have the administrator of the commingling agreement in to talk about how it works, are the ones who contract with a third party to go and do the pickups.
Okay.
We have very little oversight over the members of the commingling or the commingling agreement. The agency has, again, sort of stepping back, we have very limited responsibilities under the bottle bill and no administrative resources for it, right? So, I mean, we have no staff expressly dedicated. We have one person who spends a very small portion of their time dealing with beverage registrations, right? So when a new beverage comes in, does it or does it not need to be labeled? Does it or does it not need to be a part of the bottle? So that is what one person's job is. Beyond that, we have very little capacity to do inspections, redemption systems, do oversight of the bottle bill. This bill would allow us to have some greater capacity to do those types of things. It would allow us to budget for that.
Nice. And so you would be able to have would you be able to see some of the terms and conditions at that point with those?
So I think the benefit of H-158 is that it basically forces what is now a private commingling agreement into a public plan that has to be shared and put on notice and have public comment on that plan. And so and then I think getting to Senator Watson's question a little bit ago about small manufacturers and the organization itself, we have heard anecdotally from small manufacturers that their largest challenge in the current commingling agreements are financial barriers to entry and the costs associated with participating. And so that's one of the major concerns that we have and we expect needs to be addressed in the plan. It's not creating a barrier for small Vermont, well, frankly, for any small.
Yeah, or small.
Right, exactly. Manufacturer to participate in the commingling agreement, collecting materials.
Right, because we had small manufacturers last year say we were commingling, and then we found that we felt like we were paying too large a share.
Right.
And there was some funkiness to the accounting, and so then they stepped back out, which then increased the number of stores, so it was troubles getting to work right. So like,
Thank you, Chair Bray. This question might not be, but it makes me nervous if we were to not move forward with this bill, because I do think there is an incentive for some of the larger beverage companies to kind of slowly but surely kind of tamper down the effectiveness of the Bottle Bill program. And I'm wondering if you have seen that type of pressure with the inefficiencies that have continued to grow in the system. Do you think that there is a intentionality to some of that? What would you, or is it just we've kind of fallen down on the job as a legislature and updating it?
Well, I think it's really more that no one's accountable for the bottle bill system, right? It doesn't have sort of any individual accountable for ensuring that the system sort of achieves broader recycling and performance goals that maybe weren't thought about in 1972, but are commonly built into programs that we administer today. So, I mean, I think, so to be brief, knowing that the committee has other things on its agenda, I think there are a couple points that make sense to just go over to highlight in the bill. And that you should think, and so that you're both aware of and you can think about them as you continue on your journey. One is point of redemption, right? So you should not confuse a point of redemption with a redemption center. So it's intended to be a term that's broad in its scope and would allow for multiple different technologies or capacities for people to redeem, right? Like we're seeing different ways for people to redeem their beverages coming up in Oregon and Maine, from bag drops to reverse vending to other technologies that we don't want to inhibit the plan or the producer responsibility organization from using innovation to create additional convenience. So that's number one. Point of redemption with a direct deposit return. So that is where the redemption point, when you put the container in, whether it be at a redemption center or a reverse vending machine, you immediately receive the deposit back. Some of this technology are things like a bag drop, right? I put a clip on my bag, I scan that clip with my phone, I drop the bag at my vendor station, they take it back to a central processing facility, click my tag, run everything through a machine, and then electronically deposit the materials back to my account. So that is an existing technology that's used in a number of jurisdictions in the United States. And one that I think may end up being used by the PRO for greater convenience, but that technology doesn't afford an individual who wishes to get their deposit back immediately for a number of different reasons, or who's potentially banking limited, right?
Doesn't have a cell phone.
Doesn't have a cell phone, exactly. So that I think is an important term to think about. I think the committee should think about the definition of container. There were changes in the House to what traditionally has been the definition of container. It moves the definition towards recyclable materials, which is of course a policy choice. It means that materials that contain beverages that are otherwise subject to the bottle bill no longer have a deposit if they're not in a recyclable container. So if I have juice that's in a pouch and not in a PET bottle, then I don't have to pay a deposit on that juice in a pouch. And that is a policy choice. It's as you expand, you should think about these things.
Okay, and are you expressing a concern, for instance?
Well, I think,
like
I
motivating
think that
house sales?
well, I mean, I think it's a question of whether, whether you want to base the definition of container solely on the recyclability of that container, or whether you want to include non-recyclable containers in your definition. For example, under the current definition, bottled wine is in, boxed wine is out. So that is the effect of the definition that has been put in there. The juice in a tin can, whether it be V8 or high V or something else, has a deposit under the list, which is atypical, but
Thank you. So are you suggesting that there might be an incentive for manufacturers to move towards non-recyclable containers?
that is a possibility, and I don't actually have an answer to that, right? I don't know whether that's an unforeseen consequence of making a change like this, and whether Vermont's market in doing this would make a difference.
Yeah.
Well, so as
And Vermont.
Yeah, I know.
as the director of that solid waste division, do you have a recommendation?
Not at this time, sir.
Okay.
I will reflect on it. So I think just, again, there's probably a number of other comments. I don't want to be sensitive, knowing you want to move on to other topics. One is that just to answer the question as far as is deposit rates around the United States, and that was asked of Mr. O'Grady. I think that the top end on non-liquor is 10 cents. The top end on liquor is 15. And I say that with an asterisk that the California refund value is different, and it is not sort of a direct deposit like number. So it's more complicated and could lead to different results. Than it is a more complicated system, which I am only marginally familiar with how it operates.
So as we learn more about it, what's sort of in your mind when you say that, like, don't be cautious about doing anything more than letting an escalator bump it to a dime?
Well, I mean, I will say from the agency's perspective, our preference is basically what passed the Senate last year, which is if there are 2 consecutive quarters where a performance target is not met, that we're required to report back to you with recommendations on what the appropriate next steps are. Because, while I appreciate and increasing the deposit may be the appropriate outcome, I think that there are a lot of other outcomes that may be equally appropriate. Increasing the number of facilities that are collecting beverage containers, massively increasing the amount of consumer education and awareness. So I think that it's the thing that the agency does not like about the automatic escalators. It is both automatic and cuts off the opportunity for other remedial steps that may be more appropriate. And then just a couple other to close off. I will say, I also provided a 1-pager on how the beverage system flows. It's how the money flows, and I'm happy to talk about that at some point. It is something I think, as Marcy said, everyone gets confused about.
Yeah, it's a little like 3-card Monte.
It is. And so I'm more than happy to talk about it. We're more than happy to take it's Marcy did a great job with visuals. Mine is all on 1 page, so you can see it all on 1 page. Some people think differently. So
Have you sent that to?
I did send it to you. So please take a look at it, and I'm happy to come back in. I think another thing, just to sort of clarify the record on a couple things. Marcy had said that sometimes we count things in our diversion rate that where it's disposed of in other jurisdictions. That's not an accurate depiction of how our diversion rate gets set. So we track where things are going to be recycled. That's not to say our information is 100% accurate all the time. We do have people who have not been as transparent or honest with us. And that's what happened in Chittenden, and it resulted in an enforcement action.
Sure.
But having said that, we don't allow people to take recycled material outside of the jurisdiction and then dispose of it in a solid waste management facility. That's prohibited, and we don't count that as diversion if it were to ever happen. And I'm unaware, besides Chittenden, of ever hearing the case that has happened. So I'll just pause there and ask whether there's questions, knowing that we're over the 11:30 time.
Any questions for Mr. Shackey? I'm guessing as we get into it, we'll have more questions.
That's more than happy to come back.
And we'll ask you to come back and talk with us a little more.
Sure, and just again, follow up on one of the other questions before I conclude, the question about whether MRFs could redeem. And I think we've had that question before. There is nothing that prohibits it. I think from a practical sense, once you have commingled recyclables going into a MRF, it's very difficult for them to separate redeemable containers out and redeem them. That's not to say at some point, and it may even be likely that their existing certified transfer stations with solid waste also become points of redemption for purposes of the bottle.
Great.
All right, thank you.
So much. All right, so we are switching it up. We had an introduction to 30 by 30 last week, but at that point, we didn't have legal staff available to us, so we didn't actually have a formal walkthrough of H126. So we're going to do that prior to adjournment. I think we probably have just enough time. Thank you very much. So good morning. If you could join us at the table, introduce yourself, and then we're looking, sometimes we do, we got that upside down copy. If you can take us through at sort of an intermediate level, we're aiming to just do a walkthrough in the next 20 minutes.
Sure.
Absolutely. That'll be great. Thanks so much.
For the record, my name is Adam Washburn. I'm a student clinician with the Office of Legislative Counsel. I'm here today to do a walkthrough on H126, an act relating to community resiliency and biodiversity protection. Jump right into it. Section 1 of the bill is the short title, essentially saying that the act can be cited as the Community Resiliency and Biodiversity Protection Act, or the CRDPA. Section 2 goes over the findings. The General Assembly finds that 1, nature is facing a catastrophic loss of biodiversity, both globally and locally. 2, in addition to its intrinsic value, biodiversity is essential to human survival. 3, according to the United Nations, 1 million species of plants and animals are threatened with extinction. Human activity has altered almost 75% of the Earth's surface, squeezing wildlife and nature into ever smaller natural areas of the planet. The health of ecosystems on which humans and all other species depend is deteriorating more rapidly than ever, affecting the very foundation. Moving on to page 2 real quick. Of economies, livelihoods, food security, health, and quality of life worldwide, and the cause of the drivers of change in natural range as followed: the changes in land and sea use, direct exploitation of organisms, climate change, pollution, and invasive species. 4th, the 2017 Vermont Forest Action Plan found that fragmentation and parcelization represent major threats to forest health and productivity and exacerbate the impacts of climate change. 5th, in 2002, Acts and Resolve number 183, Department of Forests, Park and Recreations was tasked with developing a Vermont Forest Future Strategic Roadmap to strengthen, modernize, promote, and protect the forest product sector, the greater forest economy, and promote the importance of a healthy, resilient, and sustainably managed working forest that provide a diverse array of high-quality products now and in the future. 6th, the 2021 Vermont Climate Assessment highlights an increase in extreme weather events such as droughts and floods as a significant impact of climate change in Vermont, and recommends nature-based solutions as a proven low-cost strategy for climate adaptation and resilience. On to page 3. 7th, The initial Vermont Climate Action Plan calls for investing in strategic conservation to increase the pace of permanent conservation towards 30 by 30 targets, with Vermont conservation design guiding prioritization of efforts. 8, the Nature Conservancy has developed the Resilient and Connected Landscapes Project and found that Vermont plays a key role in the conservation of biodiversity regionally. 9, the Staying Connected Initiative is an international partnership of public and private organizations. Its goal is to maintain, enhance, and restore landscape connectivity for wide-ranging mammals across the northern Appalachian-Acadia region, from the Adirondack Mountains to the Maritime provinces. The Staying Connected Initiative has identified 9 linkages across the vast region that are extremely important to wildlife. 6 of these linkages lie within Vermont. 10, the Vermont Department of Fish and Wildlife, working with the Agency of Natural Resources and with the Vermont Conservation Organization, has developed Vermont Conservation Design, a framework to sustain the state's ecological functional landscape into the future. 11, intact and connected ecosystems support Vermont's biodiversity, reduce flood risk, mitigate drought, and sequester and store carbon. Page 4. 12, Vermont's most effective and efficient contribution to conserving biological diversity and maintaining a landscape resilient to climate change is to conserve an intact and connected landscape. 13, in order to maintain ecological function in intact and connected ecosystems, the full range of conservation approaches is needed, including supporting private landowner education, technical assistance, and programs, conservation easements that promote sustainable forest management, and conservation easements and fee acquisitions focused on passive management. 14, the Vermont Housing Finance Agency's 2020 Housing Needs Assessment projected an urgent pre-pandemic need for new housing. Strategic investments in conservation is consistent with the construction of housing in Vermont's villages and town centers. 15, the land and waters, forests and farms, and ecosystems and natural communities in Vermont are the traditional and unceded home of the Abenaki people. Access to land and land-based enterprises has excluded Black, Indigenous, and persons of color Vermonters and others from historically marginalized and disadvantaged communities in the centuries of European settlement. Efforts to increase land conservation must also include opportunities to increase access to land and land-based enterprises for Indigenous people and all who come from historically marginalized and disadvantaged communities. 5. Section 3, 10 VSA Chapter 89 is added to read. Chapter 89 is titled Community Resiliency and Biodiversity Protection. Section 2801 contains the definitions of the section. As used in this section, 1, ecological reserve area means an area having permanent protection from conversion of natural land cover that is managed to maintain a natural state within which natural ecological processes and disturbance events are allowed to proceed with minimal interference. 2, biodiversity conservation area means an area having permanent protection from conversion of natural land cover for the majority of the areas and that is managed for the primary goal of sustaining species or habitats. These areas may include regular, active interventions to address the needs of particular species or to maintain or restore habitats. 3, natural resource management area means an area having permanent protection from conversion of natural land cover for the majority of the area, but that is subject to long-term sustainable forest management. I'm going to stop real quick here just to note that the definition section is not in alphabetical order because the first 3 definitions are the 3 categories ranging from most restrictive to least restrictive. Thank you. 4th, sustainable forest management means the stewardship and use of forests and forest lands in a way and at a rate that maintains their biodiversity, productivity, regeneration capacity, vitality, and their potential to fulfill, on page 6 quickly, and in the future relevant ecological, economic, and social functions at a local, state, and regional level, and that does not degrade ecosystem function. 5th, conserved means permanently protected in meeting the definition of ecological reserve area, biodiversity conservation area, or natural resource management area as defined in this section. Section 2802 titled Conservation Visions and Goals. Subsection A. The vision of the state of Vermont is to maintain an ecologically functional landscape that sustains biodiversity, maintains landscape connectivity, promotes climate resilience, supports working farms and forests, provides opportunity for recreation and appreciation of the natural world, and supports historic settlement patterns of compact villages surrounded by rural lands and natural areas. Subsection B. It is the goal of the state that 30% of Vermont's total land area shall be conserved by 2030, and 50% of the state's total land area shall be conserved by 2050. The Secretary of Natural Resources shall lead the effort in achieving these goals. The land conserved shall include state, federal, municipal, and private land. Subsection C. Reaching 30% by 2030 and 50% by 2050 shall include a mixed ecological reserve areas, biodiversity conservation areas, and natural resource management areas in order to support an ecologically functional and connected landscape for sustainable production of natural resources and recreation opportunities. On to page 7. The approximate percentage of each type of conservation category shall be guided by the principles of conservation science and the conservation targets within Vermont conservation design, prioritizing ecological reserve areas to protect highest priority natural communities and maintain or restore old forests. Section 2803, subsection A, on or before July 1st, 2024, the Secretary, with assistance from the Vermont Housing and Conservation Board, shall create an inventory of Vermont's conserved lands and conservation policies to serve as the basis of meeting the conservation goals of Vermont conservation design and to meet the goals established by section 2802 of this title. The inventory shall be submitted for review to the House Committees on Environment and Energy and on Agriculture, Food Resiliency, and Forestry, and the Senate Committee on Natural Resources and Energy. Subsection B, this is what the inventory shall include. 1, a review of the 3 conservation categories as defined in section 2801 of this title, and suggestions for developing any modifications or additions to these categories that maintain or complement the core concepts of ecological reserve areas, biodiversity conservation areas, and natural resource management areas in order to complete the conserved land inventory and inform the comprehensive strategy in the conservation plan. 2, the amount of conserved land in Vermont that fits into each of the 3 conservation categories defined in section 2801 of this title, including public and private land. The inventory shall also include other lands permanently protected from the development by fee ownership or subject to conservation easements. 3, a summary of the totality of conservation practices, both permanent and intermediate, available for reaching the goals of this chapter, including what they are, what they do, how they contribute, and what metrics are available to quantify them. 4, an assessment of how state lands will be used to increase conserved ecological reserve areas. 5, the implementation of methods that can be utilized for achieving the goals of this chapter using Vermont conservation design as a guide. 6, an assessment of how water is protected in the state and how protection of aquatic systems may be addressed in the plan. 7, how existing programs will be used to meet the permanent non-conversion conservation goals of this chapter and recommendations for new programs that will be needed to meet the goals. 8, an assessment of existing funding and recommendations for new funding sources that will be needed for acquisition of land purchase or donation of conservation easement staffing capacity and long-term stewardship to meet its goals. Now on page 9, line 3. 9, an equity of assessment of existing land protection and conservation strategies and programs. And 10, an evaluation of the opportunities related to intergenerational land transfer trends and how the state could proactively direct resources to achieve conservation at the time of transfer. Now on section 2804, the conservation plan. Subsection A, on or before December 31st, 2025, the Secretary, with assistance from the Vermont Housing and Conservation Board, shall develop a plan to implement the conservation goals of Vermont conservation design and to meet the goals established in section 2802 of this title. The plan shall be submitted for review to the House Committee on Environment and Energy and on Agriculture, Food Resiliency, and Forestry, and the Senate Committee on Natural Resources and Energy. Subsection B details what the plan shall include. 1, a comprehensive strategy for achieving the goals of section 2802 of this title while continuing to conserve and protect Vermont's agricultural land, working forests, historic properties, recreational lands, and surface waters. 2, the implementation methods for achieving the vision and goals of this chapter using Vermont conservation design as a guide. On to page 9, page 10, I apologize. 3, recommendations to increase equitable access to protected and conserved lands and land-based enterprises. And 4, recommendations to implement the visions and goals of this chapter while also enhancing the state of Vermont's current investments and commitments to working land enterprises, rural landowners, and the broad conservation mission implemented by the Secretary and VHCB, including conservation of agricultural lands, working forests, historic properties, recreational lands, and surface waters. Subsection C. In developing the plan, the Secretary, with assistance from the Vermont Housing and Conservation Board, shall hold 12 or more public meetings on the plan between July 1st, 2023 and December 31st, 2025 to solicit input from stakeholders. Stakeholders shall include private owners of forest lands and agricultural lands, land trusts, conservation organizations, environmental organizations, working land enterprises, outdoor recreation groups and businesses, indigenous groups and representatives from historically marginalized and disadvantaged communities, municipalities, regional planning commissions, conservation commissions, and relevant state and federal agencies. At least 3 of the meetings shall be designed to solicit comments from the general public. Subsection D, the conserved land inventory established in 2803 of this title shall be updated biannually to track progress toward meeting the goals of this chapter. It's page 11, which shall be publicly available, and the secretary shall submit a report to the relevant committees on or before January 15th following each update. Section 4 contains the appropriation for this bill. The sum of $75,000 is appropriated from the general fund to the Vermont Housing and Conservation Board in fiscal year 2024 to support public education and outreach to inform the development of a statewide conservation plan. And section 5 is the effective date. This act shall take effect July 1st, 2020.
Popcorn, you get an A for steady, fast reading. But I was, we started late and you made it all the way through anyway. So that was very helpful. I think one thing that I'd like to come back to, and I know it's already come up briefly in a committee discussion for a future visit, is on page 8, on line 1415. There's a reference in terms of to an assessment of how water is protected in the state and how protection of aquatic systems may be addressed in the plan. I know there's some controversy over well, let me just say it this way. Different people have different thoughts about how we might address water and aquatic systems. I need to learn more. I think the community needs to learn more. Does it or does it not include riparian areas as opposed to just waters of the state? So I'm just flagging that, as I know it's already come up with some informal conversations so far. With that, any questions for Mr. Washburn? All right. So, Senator Clark.
This is an inventory, this is mainly aspirational, right? It's just gathering information and developing like a plan, but nothing's gonna actually happen, is that right?
So this bill is aspirational. It has a goal to achieve 30 by 30 and 50 by 50. The only mandates or mandatory things that this bill does is to create an inventory of how we might conserve lands and then a plan based on that inventory.
So here we are, just a few minutes before noon. If there aren't any more questions for Mr. Washburn, we would just check in with people on schedule for the balance of the week. We may have a little time tomorrow between working on bills. If so, members of the committee could have 1 or 2 more candidates for recommendation for appointment confirmation. That would be great. Senator McCormick already knocked all his out of the park last week, so but if you can get 1 or 2 ready, then when we have the gaps between committee work, we might be able to move a few more in. Any other questions, concern, discussion before we adjourn for work? Thank you, everyone, and